Many thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, check the link in the description. But now, enjoy the video. Welcome to Gran Turismo Origins. This is the beginning of my personal retrospective into the Gran Turismo series of racing games. I've already spent a lot of time making videos about Gran Turismo over the past few years. I guess it's only natural considering it is my all-time favourite series. But something I wanted to do for a while now is to dive into exactly why that's the case. These games can be split into two distinct eras, the first encompassing the initial 6 mainline titles, and the second from Gran Turismo Sport onwards. Now, there is no shortage of review-style content on that second category when it comes to my channel, and I think my thoughts on the current state of the franchise have been made very clear. But what about those first 6 games? If you follow my content, then you'll already know that my outlook on them is far more positive. But nothing is ever so simple. Gran Turismo itself redefined the racing game genre in more ways than people often realise. Whether it be the menu design and music, the visuals and graphical breakthroughs, the driving and physics simulation, the cars and tracks, and especially the game design and single-player structure, we're going to cover all of it. I'm leaving no stone unturned in my quest to completely understand this series. And not only that, but we're going to cover these games from multiple perspectives. Not just how we view them now in current day, but also how they were viewed at the time. As the purpose these games served has changed over time, so has people's opinions on them. And by comparing these, we can gain some really fascinating insights about this series. So that's my goal, to put aside all sentimentality and view these games for what they really are. How did we go from this to this? And besides the obvious, what really changed? We'll observe every trend we can and analyse each and every success and failure of these games to understand what makes this series so special and how each of these games fit into that story. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We've got 6 whole games to get through, and we're of course kicking this off with the one that started it all, the original Gran Turismo. Let me set the scene. The story of Gran Turismo is the story of one man and his dream. Kazunori Yamauchi was born in Chiba, Japan in 1967, and from a very young age he developed an interest in cars. It got to the point that he was soon able to name every car he would see driving in his town. As he grew older, his passion for the automotive world increased even further. As an adult, he would own various high-performance sports cars, such as the Toyota Supra, Nissan 300ZX, and Nissan Skyline GTR, the latter of which he would crash whilst going over 120 miles an hour on the highway, a very formative lesson for him. Having such an interest in cars led to him playing many driving games at the time, but it was always an experience that left him wanting. He lamented how controlling the cars in these games didn't really feel anything like driving a car for real. By 1992, at the age of 25, Kazunori was working at Sony Music Entertainment Japan. At the same time, Sony itself was planning to enter the video game console market. After a tie-up with Nintendo went sour, it was decided that they would go it alone, with the Sony PlayStation being announced to the public in late 1993. However, Sony would need games for their new console, and whilst they ended up partnering with and even acquiring many third-party developers, they also looked internally. This is where Kaz comes into the picture, as he was approached by Shuhei Yoshida, one of the main figures behind the PlayStation project. Initially surprised by the thought of making games, he soon warmed up to the idea, writing up around 100 game proposals in total. But there was one that really stood out. It was for what he called a hyper-real driving simulator. Essentially, it would be a racing game that placed a bigger emphasis on the dynamics of driving, and featured an expansive roster of real-world cars. Nothing like it had ever been done before, and the higher-ups at Sony saw it as too much of a risk for their brand new console. So instead, Kaz placed his efforts on another project for the time being. This would become MotorToon Grand Prix, a cartoony 3D racer released in Japan in late 1994. But although on the surface it appeared nothing like his hyper-real driving simulator proposal, within it could be found some surprisingly deep driving mechanics. The way the vehicles handled conveyed a sense of weight that wasn't like many other games at the time. The title sold well enough to earn a sequel in 1996, MotorToon Grand Prix 2, and this was even released in the West. The game boasted even further refined handling, and a bonus mode that replaced the cartoon vehicles with realistic race cars. Despite his driving simulator pitch being shot down, Kaz never gave up on the idea. In fact, since 1992, he continued to work on the project in secret, eventually being joined by the small development team assembled for the MotorToon games named Polly's Entertainment. Unknowingly, Sony had furthered his project project by publishing these games, both of which served as testbeds for Kaz's true vision. And with all of these pieces in place, Sony finally gave their blessing for Kaz to develop his dream game. But it wouldn't be easy. When you're trying to push the boundaries within a medium, it never is. Not only did Kaz want to develop a racing game with realistic handling, he also wanted it to look as close to reality as possible. He also envisioned an in-depth tuning and upgrade system where cars could be fitted with new parts that improved performance, much like in real life. Not to mention the cars themselves. Toyota was the first brand to give their approval to the idea, and soon many others followed. Not just Japanese ones, but even a handful of international makes. After 5 long years, an unprecedented amount of time in the games industry, where many of the developers barely even left the office, the game was finally ready. It just needed a name. For this, Kaz settled on Gran Turismo. The term originates from Grand Tour, a cultural trip through Europe that became a custom for many aristocrats starting in the 17th century. The name essentially implying that this game would be like a grand tour of automotive culture. Despite pouring so much time and effort into this project, Kaz and his team knew that it was a very niche idea. They thought that given how specialized it was, that it would only have a very specific audience. And I suppose that only makes what happened next all the more incredible. Gran Turismo debuted in late 1997, and it's no exaggeration to say that it rocked the racing game world. This was a game that boasted top-of-the-line graphics, a massive selection of fully licensed cars, a deep and rewarding gameplay loop, and of course a driving experience that was unparalleled on console. So why don't we actually play the game and see what it's all about? This game gives a pretty unique impression right from the get-go. The menus are made up of garish orange contrasting with black backgrounds. It's very 90s. To go with it, we also have a soundtrack that's just as in your face. It was composed by Jason Page and inspired by the electronic/industrial movement of the day. However, if you were playing the game in Japan, these menus sound totally different. Over there, the soundtrack is made up of funk and jazz fusion composed by Isamu Ohira. His songs Mr. Four-Wheel Drive and Take Your Dream On, used in the Subaru and Aston Martin dealerships respectively, are some of my favourites. But even though I prefer this OST, I actually think the Western soundtrack fits the vibe of the game a bit better. For me, the smooth and refined music in the Japanese version seems at odds with the very loud visual design. Anyway, you have to remember that when playing these games, the menus and music will almost always be our first impression. And typically when we think back to these older games in retrospect, the menus and music will again be one of the first things that come to our minds. They actually influence our perception of these games more than you might think. But with that said, what's really important is what happens when you hit the track. When this game came out in 1997, it looked the business. I have to tell you this explicitly because to modern eyes, it really doesn't look all that impressive. But the devil is in the details, something that will emerge as a theme when it comes to Gran Turismo. What's amazing is how they use so few polygons to create these car models, and yet they're all instantly recognizable as the cars they represent, even from a distance. The track environments too are decently detailed, if slightly sparse in places owing to memory limitations. But one of GT1's biggest draws in the graphical department is the reflections on the cars. A very minute detail to point out, but it was something that set it apart from pretty much every other racing game of the time. It makes the cars feel a lot more integrated into these environments. One of the best ways to sample this is with the game's revolutionary replay mode. This is another area that GT1 excels in, with its replay system being considered truly exceptional, and it still holds up well to this day. For the time, the cars in this game looked great, but they also sounded decent as well. Most engine notes are unique from one another. You're not going to mistake a GTR for a Viper, for example, but there was still room for improvement when it came to their accuracy. This is an area that Kaz himself has admitted was compromised during development. But if you don't like the engine sounds, you can just drown them out with the music. Yet again, this is an area where the various versions of the game differ. In the West, we got a soundtrack that was very loud and aggressive, featuring high-tempo licensed tunes that helped to amp up the racing action. PAL regions also got a few extra songs, mainly from the band Feeder. In Japan, things were again more subdued, but nowhere near as much of a contrast as the menu music. The songs there are all original and composed by Masahiro Ando, the guitarist for the band T-Square, and that includes the song from the intro movie, Moon Over the Castle. This song is iconic and has since become a part of Gran Turismo's identity. In the West, our intro movie got a Chemical Brothers remix of a Manic Street Preachers song, Everything Must Go. It doesn't fit quite as well. However, I have to say that the build-up in this version includes my personal favourite 15 seconds from any Gran Turismo intro ever. Seriously, that gives me chills every time. But now we're officially done with the music. If we're talking about the original Gran Turismo, the real star of the show, the thing that got players and game reviewers raving back in the day, is the driving. Again, this is something that's hard to fully grasp unless you were actually there at the time. But what you need to understand is that in those days, no console racing game handled like Gran Turismo, not even close. Yes, there were early sims, like Jeff Cramman's Grand Prix series for example, that did have more realistic handling, but for the Polys team to achieve such a level of handling detail across so many different cars, and on the original PlayStation, was truly a marvel. In contrast to most other racers, the cars feel weighty and expressive, and the level of grip the tyres have at any one moment is clearly communicated. It's worth noting that the DualShock controller debuted just 1 month before GT1 itself, and this was actually the first game to fully support its analog sticks, which can be used for steering as well as brake and throttle. Steering with the D-pad and using the face buttons to accelerate and slow down is still very doable, but some of the detail is lost. I think the best way to explain how impressive this handling model is to demonstrate using the 4 different drivetrain configurations present in the game: FR, FF, MR, and all-wheel drive. FR cars can suffer with gradual oversteer but also understeer on corner exits. FF cars are very responsive on corner entry but not so much when on the power. MR cars are generally well balanced but can be prone to snap oversteer when pushed too hard over uneven surfaces or with bad settings. And all-wheel drive cars are quite stable, but some do have oversteer on corner entry and then understeer on exits. These traits, albeit oversimplified for this explanation, are generally consistent with how these types of cars drive in real life. But there is a lot more nuance to it. Cars with the same drivetrain can handle differently from one another depending on various factors, giving each of them a unique personality. However, GT1's handling isn't perfect. Certain cars tend to have a habit of bouncing strangely on one side when driven over uneven surfaces like curbs. It can get really frustrating to deal with, but this can be improved by making the rear springs and dampers softer. We'll talk more about upgrades and tuning later on, but for now, let's dive into the meat of this game, the content. As previously stated, this game had a huge amount of cars for its time, somewhere between 140 and 150 depending on region. Albeit many of these cars are alternate versions of each other, but it's still impressive. As expected, the car list is made up of mostly contemporary Japanese models. If you were a car enthusiast in Japan at the time, there was a very good chance that your car was featured here. There are also a handful of overseas models courtesy of Aston Martin, Chevrolet, Dodge, and TVR, adding a touch of variety. In terms of tracks, there are 11 unique locations, all of which being fictional, which is roughly around what you'd expect for the time. However, within these 11, there is also a decent amount of variety, from the simple bankings of High Speed Ring, all the way up to the complex streets of Special Stage Route 11. Something I'm always astounded by when I play this game is just how good these original designs still are. It's a point that was further driven home when I made my ranking of every original circuit in Gran Turismo, and most of these featured in the top half. They're each memorable in their own way, and plenty of fun to drive as well. What I also love is how they're done up to make them look like real racetracks. Details like pit buildings, overhead gantries, and signage featuring mostly real-world brands, such as Castrol Oil and Bridgestone tyres. It just makes everything feel that bit more authentic. You know, it's all well and good excelling on a technical level and impressing on the content side, but to me, that's all just a platform. I've always been of the view that what really matters in a racing game is what you do with these elements. And now we can finally talk about what makes Gran Turismo truly special, in my opinion. Gran Turismo, or Simulation Mode, is the main campaign mode of this game. Now, I am far from the first person to do a retrospective on this series, but there's always something that's bugged me. Whenever people talk about these games, they of course mention the single-player career as an important factor in what makes them so enjoyable to play, but they don't tend to dive that deeply into how they actually work. For this series, I'm going to change that. From my point of view, if a Gran Turismo game doesn't have a good career, it simply isn't a good Gran Turismo. It matters more to me than almost anything else in these games. This is why I've spent the past 2 years playing through each of these titles again, so that I can gain a complete understanding of what makes a Gran Turismo career mode fundamentally enjoyable. Using this experience, we can then compare each of these games against each other and understand where they differ, where they're the same, and see how that all affects how we play through them. Being the original, GT1 had no real points of reference for people playing it back in the day, but we can still analyse what exactly it does. This game was revolutionary for combining role-playing elements with a racing game. It was an idea that hadn't really been done much before, and certainly nowhere near the scale of GT1. The basic idea is this: you start at the bottom of the ladder with the slowest cars, and gradually work your way up by winning races, earning faster cars and using them to win tougher races, until you can win the final event and beat the game. Now that on its own doesn't sound all too revolutionary. Plenty of other arcade-style racing games were already doing a similar type of progression, but it's the specifics of how GT1 does this, making use of its massive car roster and deeper simulation aspects, that truly sets it apart. To start off, you're not simply given a car, you actually have to go out and buy one. This game is built around an economy where the currency is called credits. Everything in this game costs a certain amount of credits, and you can earn more by completing races. To start the game, you're given 10,000 credits to buy your first car. The cars themselves are contained within dealerships for each brand. But it doesn't end there. Most dealerships contain 2 sets of cars, new cars and used cars. The implication is pretty obvious. New cars represent the latest models, whereas used cars are generally older models that are sold at a reduced price. What this means is that your first car pretty much has to be a used one, because that's all you can afford. But within that, you still have plenty of choice. In comparison to most racing games of the time, this was a far more open-ended way of doing things, where the rules of the system, like the credits and how much things cost, are clearly defined, but you're free to act within those rules however you want to. Now, I appreciate that if you've ever played a Gran Turismo game before, this will all seem very basic, but as the first game in the series, I really want to underline what exactly GT1 did differently from other racing games at the time. What you'll start to notice is how it takes ideas from the real world, like car dealerships, and uses them as game design elements that add depth to the experience. And this is just one example. So say you've chosen your first car and want to get racing. Well, not so fast, buddy, you still need to earn your license. Yep, this game makes you take a license test before you can race. Actually, to be more specific, 8 license tests. These are short timed challenges that focus on specific driving techniques. Now, whilst all they appear to do is gatekeep you from entering race events until you're good enough, one of their main purposes is actually to help you understand the driving physics. This is why they start off so basic, just requiring you to accelerate and stop within a certain distance. You see, with this more in-depth handling model, the developers were concerned that players would find it difficult to control the cars. This point is also hammered home by the instruction manual of the game, which contains an entire 37-page section dedicated to explaining driving techniques. Wow, remember when games actually came with instruction manuals? Wild. But anyway, this is a big reason for why these licenses exist. There are 3 in total, each getting gradually harder, but unlocking more race events. These tests are notorious for being pretty tough, but you only need to clear the bronze times to get the license. If you can manage to clear the gold times as well, you even earn a unique car for each license, so it's definitely worth trying. But now we can finally race. You'll want to head over to the Sunday Cup in the GT League, as it's likely the only event you can actually win at this point. What makes GT1 unique among Gran Turismo games is that almost every event consists of a multiple race championship. You earn points based on your finishing position, and these are tallied up over each race to determine the final results. This is typically what would be called a Grand Prix mode in most arcade racing games. With these races, you're also given the ability to qualify, which is a 1-lap time trial, the results of which determines which position you start in. You even earn a small credits bonus for getting pole position, but that's about all it's really good for. You see, GT1 was originally planned to have as many as 12 cars on track at any time, but this ended up being scaled back to just 6 due to system limitations. I feel like qualifying is somewhat a remnant of this, as it makes hardly any difference in this game. You can go from last to first, or vice versa, in a matter of seconds. opponents. But whilst we're on the topic of opponent cars, let's talk about the AI. Naturally, you need opponents to race against in these events, and the CPUs serve that role. Coming back to this game, I didn't have the highest expectations for the AI, and they're just about what I was anticipating. They can be decent, but most of the time seem completely oblivious to where you are on track. However, although the driving physics were quite sophisticated for the time, the collision physics were not. What this means is that you can collide with other cars and even walls and nothing really happens. You just sort of bounce off. Given the AI's awareness, that's kind of for the best. In terms of speed, they're actually pretty solid. There isn't too much rubber banding that I can notice, and they seem to be pretty consistent across most tracks. I wouldn't say they're one of GT's strongest areas, but in this game they're serviceable. What you'll notice about the race events in GT1 is that, compared to the games that come after it, you actually earn quite a lot of money from them. Part of this is thanks to receiving a healthy championship bonus, but there is a reason why the game is so generous. Let's talk about the career mode structure. There are two sets of events in this game, the GT League and Special Events. The GT League contains only 4 events, but one of those is the Gran Turismo World Cup. Beating this event is the ultimate goal of the game, but how do you get in a position to do that? Well, first, you need to finish in at least the top 3 in the 3 other events here. But if you try to do them one after the next, you'll quickly realise that isn't the best idea, as the speed of the opponents ramps up considerably. And this is where the special events come in. This is a wider selection of events that cater to specific types of cars. They're filtered based on things like drivetrain type, nationality, and even more. How GT1's career works is that these special events are effectively supplemental to your progression in the GT League. And this is where the game truly opens up, because depending on what types of cars you have, you will compete in different events and in a different order. Not only that, but by completing each event, you earn a prize car that is relevant to that event, such as an FR drivetrain car from the FR Challenge. What both of these design decisions do is break cars down by their attributes, and give you a reason to drive a wide variety of different machines. Think about it like this: what would be the point of having 150 cars in the game if you could beat every race with just 1 or 2? This is how Gran Turismo deals with that fundamental issue by giving more cars purpose and players a reason to use them. What this also does is add an intriguing layer of strategy to a playthrough, because not only do you need to focus on getting faster cars, but also building out your collection with more variety. You'll need an FF car, FR car, and an all-wheel drive car, a Japanese car, American car, or British car, and so there are plenty of choices to consider. And when you then think about which options you may have at any given point, such as upgrading a car and continuing to use it, or buying a completely new one, there really are no right or wrong decisions. This, to me, gets to the core of what really makes a Gran Turismo game enjoyable, and each of the games I'll talk about in this series do this in slightly different ways. When it comes to GT1 specifically, given that it was the first of its kind, it would definitely be improved on in the future games. In total, there are only 16 events in this game, so even if you use a different car for every one, you'll still only be touching a fraction of the car list. Although the career mode represents a lot of what Gran Turismo is about, we should still mention its other main mode, Arcade. Arcade mode is far more traditional in its design. It contains 3 main options: single-player races, time trials, and 2-player split screen, all of which are fairly self-explanatory. You start off with a limited selection of cars and tracks, but can unlock more by winning races on the 3 difficulty levels. Each of the cars are sorted into 3 performance classes, and you'll always race against opponent cars of the same class. In essence, GT1's arcade mode is akin to what a lot of other racing games around this time were like, full stop. Compared to GT mode, there's clearly far less depth. But it's still quite incredible to think that GT1 was able to do what most other racing games already did, on top of its revolutionary career. Essentially, given that it offered both experiences, in many ways it was the only racing game that you would ever need. Further differentiating the 2 modes is the fact that arcade features massively different handling. The cars drive considerably faster and have much more grip, as well as simplified characteristics. Some of the tracks even have jumps thrown in. Of course, this all ties in with the much more pick up and play ethos of arcade mode, but it's the implications of this that really intrigue me. Everything in GT mode is just so self-assured. Despite being a trendsetter in many different areas, you get the feeling that Kaz and his team truly believed in every single design decision they made. But the choice to simplify the handling so much in arcade mode, to me seems like the only sign of their confidence wavering when it comes to their ultimate vision. The decision to do this was based on concerns that Western audiences might not take to the more realistic handling, so arcade mode was designed almost as a backup for the worst case scenario. Whether this decision was made by the Polys team or at the behest of Sony, I'm not entirely sure. Either way, given this handling is only found in arcade mode, it's not a big deal, but the fact that they never repeated it in any GT game after this is interesting to think about. Getting back to GT mode, let's now talk about the tuning shop. Upgrading your car is yet another core feature in GT1 that wasn't so widespread in racing games at the time. Where most games would make do with basic sliders that determine car stats, in GT1 everything is grounded to real-world logic. You can upgrade your engine, tyres, suspension, transmission, do weight reduction, and even more. Each of these areas have multiple tiers of parts, adding even more depth. Naturally, every part is given a detailed description explaining exactly what they do in real life, which almost always matches up with the game. What all of this means is that you can actually use real-life knowledge to help you tune your cars by understanding what areas you need to focus on the most and choosing parts that will provide the biggest benefits. I feel like a broken record at this point, but again, there weren't many racing games that even came close in this respect. But it goes even deeper, because with certain parts, like the suspension and transmission, you can then adjust individual settings on the higher grades, fine-tuning the car's characteristics to exactly how you want them. Again, this is where actual real-world knowledge can be applied to the game, but it's obviously not perfect. One quite funny oversight is that if you give cars a lot of rake, which is when you set the rear ride height much higher than the front, this confuses the physics engine and makes it think the car is constantly going downhill. As such, you end up with much improved straight-line performance. But anyway, when it comes to playing through this game, upgrading your car is hugely important. For example, what you'll notice is that after beating the Sunday Cup, every other event represents a massive step up in difficulty. This means that you pretty much have to upgrade your ride if you want to compete. Personally, I would recommend fitting racing soft tyres to every car you drive from here on out. Trust me, it'll make playing through this game much less frustrating. Not upgrading your car enough or prioritizing the wrong upgrades is a pitfall that I think a lot of people fall into when playing GT1. That's because, when compared to the games that come after it, you need to be a lot more aggressive in this area. The prize cars you earn in the early to mid game are not great. To be honest, you're better off just selling them. And whilst you do earn decent money, upgrading what you already have will often represent better value than just buying a faster car. Like I mentioned earlier, given that you will need a variety of cars for the different events, buying cars still plays a crucial role. But in that event, you need to be strategic. Think about how much mileage you'll actually get out of each car, which events they're eligible for, and how long they'll stay competitive for with upgrades. The different cars in this game have varying amounts of tuning potential, and this is yet another area where having real-world knowledge will help you out. Now, Gran Turismo is often described as like a love letter to cars, but part of that also encompasses a motorsport influence. This is something that I think is already felt very strongly in GT1. Not only are there details with the track design and real-life sponsors like I've mentioned, but also in terms of the cars. There are many special racing variants in this game, some of which being clearly based on real-life race cars, and others entirely fictional dream cars cooked up by the developers. I have to say that even now, some of these original designs are really quite impressive. These cars represent the upper limit of performance in this game, but there is another type of race car. Almost every road car in GT1 can have a racing modification upgrade. What this does is essentially transform the car into a pure track machine, complete with custom wheels, wings, and race-inspired decals. But aside from the visual changes, it also gives the cars an extra stage of weight reduction and adjustable downforce. Now, for what it is, it may seem a bit overpriced, but when compared to buying a purpose-built race car, they're actually incredible value. Also, just like the special models, many of them represent homages to real-life race cars. As you progress through the game, you will most likely end up race modifying at least one of your cars, so they represent yet another branching path on your playthrough. Most of the races in GT1 are naturally quite short, the longest ones you'll find only last 5 laps. However, if you are looking for a more realistic race simulation, this game has got you covered. Within the special events, there are 3 self-proclaimed endurance races. These are races that take place across the 2 toughest circuits in the game, Grand Valley Speedway and Special Stage Route 11, and last considerably longer than any other race. Adding to this, they also feature a tyre wear mechanic, meaning that your tyres will gradually lose grip, as represented by their colour on this graphic, until you come into the pits and change them. These factors add up to create the closest this game comes to real-life professional racing. For example, the race at Grand Valley is clearly a reference to the All Japan Japan GT Championship. The race distance of 300 kilometers is consistent with the real-life series, and the cars you race against also fit the theme. In fact, your prize for winning this race is the now legendary JGTC Toyota Castrol Supra. The only problem with the Enduros is that, although the game has both hard and soft tyre compounds, the only difference is their level of grip. They still wear out at the same rate. Regardless, the fact that they attempted this at all is a pretty clear statement. They're clearly not for everyone, but I feel like these races show what GT1 as an experience is truly capable of. The impact that Gran Turismo had when it released cannot be overstated. From the moment it hit store shelves in Japan on December 23rd, 1997, it was an instant sensation. Within just a few months, GT1 had gone double platinum, selling over 2 million copies in Japan alone. It was such a big deal that even Western outlets were reporting on this incredible new racing game months before they could even play it. And when it did eventually find its way overseas half a year later, its reputation was already established. In fact, so much so that prior to its North American release, Sony printed posters with the words, "The greatest racing game of all time is coming." Now that's a statement. But given that GT1 would then go on to become the best-selling PS1 game ever, maybe they could have even scratched racing off if they were feeling brave enough. With this success, Gran Turismo was now firmly established as one of PlayStation's biggest IPs. It was a major coup for Sony that further cemented them as a leading player in the console market. The almost overnight success of the series caused shockwaves in other areas as well. For Kaz and his team at Poly's Entertainment, GT1 changed everything. What was just a small internal team within Sony was re-established as its own separate company in April 1998. With it came a new name, Polyphony Digital, which the company is still known as to this very day. For the car brands who were initially skeptical of the idea, there were also massive benefits. Famously, British sports car maker TVR saw a massive increase in sales in Japan owing almost entirely to their appearance in the game. It seemed as though GT had really tapped into the automotive zeitgeist, and almost 30 years on, that's become even more poignant. Within the racing game scene, GT1 was a quite literal game changer. It's no exaggeration to say that Gran Turismo redefined what was possible in the genre. Its release would set in motion a chain of events that has influenced pretty much every major racing game franchise to this day. When we think back to Kaz's original vision for this game, you'd be hard-pressed to say that it failed to deliver in any aspect. It clearly wasn't perfect, but when compared to everything else on the market, it offered an extremely fresh and dynamic take on the racing genre. The irony of GT1 is that, despite Kaz himself saying he knew that it was a niche game concept, one of the greatest achievements of this game was in how it appealed to so many people. For those who had any interest in cars, it was a no-brainer, whether they were just casual fans or die-hard enthusiasts. The complex upgrade and tuning system appealed to the latter, but the massive selection of models was a big draw for both parties. And beyond just those who had a passion for cars, this game was still a must-have. The graphics and driving simulation made it a technical standout, and the rewarding gameplay loop could be enjoyed by anyone, regardless of their interests. This game could truly be all things to all people. Being the progenitor of this style of game, GT1 also benefited more from these factors than any of its sequels. When looking at reviews of this game from the time, they're overwhelmingly positive as you might expect. The only major criticism was for its license system, which was noted for being tedious and needlessly difficult. GameSpot in particular remarked that the tests were often harder to beat than the races they unlocked. Wow, I hope they don't make that mistake again. But in the grand scheme of things, these issues were minor. In 1997 to 1998, it would have been hard to imagine racing games getting any better than this. However, we know that they obviously did. So what do people actually think about this game now in current day? Well, back in December, I put a poll up asking my fellow Gran Turismo fans to vote on their personal favourite GT game from the 8 mainline titles so far. And after receiving well over 1,000 total votes, here are the results. Now don't worry, I will be going through these in more detail when we cover each respective game, but for the sake of this video, all you need to focus on is this. The original Gran Turismo came in dead last with just over 1% of the total votes, behind GT7 and even GT Sport. Now of course we have to caveat this by saying that this sample size is relatively small, but the result is still clear. So does this result represent a clear negative shift in perception towards this game? No, not at all. What this result is actually a reflection of is how thoroughly the game has been made obsolete by its sequels. Almost every aspect of this game, whether it be in terms of graphics, physics, content, structure, or whatever, has been improved in the later titles, including its direct sequel. Quite honestly, there is very little reason why you would ever choose to play GT1 over the games that came after it. It's a really interesting case. Even though GT1 is still heralded as one of the greatest racing games of all time, nobody really plays it anymore, unlike its successors. And yet, despite the fact that it's become arguably the least popular of these games over the years, you would be extremely hard-pressed to find anyone saying something negative about it. Of the few people who did vote for GT1, most cite the fact that it was their first exposure to the series as a key factor, although there were a couple who approved of its shorter career, incentivizing you to do multiple playthroughs. From my point of view, GT1 was slightly before my time. I started with Gran Turismo 3 and have been playing these games ever since, but I didn't get around to the PS1 games until many years later. As such, that makes it a lot easier for me to be impartial since I don't have any real attachment to this game. So, in my honest opinion, would I recommend playing this game in current day? Well, if you're a fan of this franchise, my answer is a resounding yes. Despite their various flaws, I believe that each of the 6 games I'll be covering are still worth playing even now. From my perspective, they all have unique traits that make me want to revisit them from time to time. However, in the case of GT1s, that's not the easiest to determine. As I said, this game doesn't really do anything the best out of all of these games, but I do still have an answer. For me, the best reason to play GT1 in current day is for its purity. What do I mean by that exactly? Well, what's become clear to me through the course of making this video is that GT1 is the purest vision of what Gran Turismo is, based on Kaz's original idea. Yes, it's a little rough around the edges when compared to the games that come after it, but for me that only adds to this point. The analogy I'd use to explain this is that the original Gran Turismo is like raw diamond ore, whereas the other games are like far more polished forms of diamond. Naturally, they're more desirable, but the purity of GT1 does have a certain charm. And if, like me, you're really invested in analysing this series, that is invaluable. Playing this game is fundamental to our understanding of what Gran Turismo is, what it aims to do, and what it represents. So for any fan of this series who hasn't given it a go already, I implore you to check it out. At one point in time, GT1 was the best Gran Turismo because it was the only Gran Turismo. That may just be a technicality, but something that can't be denied is that this game will always stand as the most influential entry in this series, and quite possibly the most influential racing game ever created.